Welcome to those of you that are joining us today. My name is Terry Murphy, and I'm the Associate Director of Peacebuilding Research here at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. This is the second webinar in the Measuring Peace series. We are exploring the various ways the concept of peace and peace research are understood, the different approaches and methods that are used to study peace, and it's an opportunity to learn from real-time peace research being conducted in conflict-affected areas around the world. In our first webinar, Dr. Roddy Brett and Dr. Roger McGinty discussed their Getting On With It project. Using mixed methods and a participatory approach, they are mapping the strategies and tactics people in post-accord Lebanon, Northern Ireland, and Colombia have been using to go on living and providing for their families, even as tensions remain. Their lens is on the hyperlocal, on specific streets and neighborhoods, contexts within the state that remain vulnerable. They were careful not to use the term post-conflict because for these individuals and communities, conflict is anything but post. Violence, or the potential for violence, is an everyday reality. And yet, somehow life goes on and people figure out how to maneuver and negotiate around the unsaid and unsettled. Roddy made the case that conflict recidivism and poor quality settlements contribute to global and national security concerns, to not peace. The felt experience of peace dividends in the everyday is low because multidimensional change is complex and it takes a long time. Top-down peace arrives slowly on people's doorsteps. During transitions from violence to peace, governance and state structures often remain weak, political tensions and exclusions persist, intergroup and interpersonal reconciliation is brittle, so the work of building or rebuilding peace becomes especially critical. And one of the early signals that a constructive transition may be happening is an ability to coexist. It may seem like a low bar, but it's a necessary one. Building on to the first webinar, today we're going to delve deeper into the troubled peace of Northern Ireland, learning how individuals and groups in local communities and neighborhoods have been adapting since the Good Friday Agreement. We know that in places like Lebanon, Colombia, and Northern Ireland, pockets or areas of violence remain. There are spaces where peace-building efforts are resisted, even subverted. Residual conflict actors dig in hyperlocally, no longer attempting to take over state power. They fill power gaps in delimited communities, creating and maintaining parallel power systems called micro-territories. The hold on these communities is fed by intimidation, fear, distrust, and criminality. Violence that for some has become so normalized, it has maladapted into a way of life. It is how they have been getting on with it. Our speakers will be weaving together and describing Northern Ireland's troubled peace, the legacies of conflict, particularly persistent paramilitary behavior. They'll also be discussing the government's effort to tackle paramilitarism through research, policy, and interventions. And they'll also talk with us about how these efforts integrate or interface with academic research and how that research translates to policy and local interventions. Adele Brown is the director of Northern Ireland's Executives Tackling Paramilitarism, Criminality, and Organized Crime program, and Claire Hazelton is a research analyst for the program. Claire is also on the advisory committee for Mershon's co-sponsored Transitioning from Violence initiative. They will be sharing for approximately 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please do feel free to raise your questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the chat function. Welcome, Adele and Claire. We look forward to learning from you.
Terry, thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everybody for joining what we hope will be not just us talking, but lots of other people asking questions and offering opinions and views as well. We're going to work through a presentation as Terry said, if you've got any questions, please do ask as you're going along, or we'll hopefully get some time at the end. Before I start to work through what is on your screen, it might be worth pausing just to reflect on the picture that's in front of us. This is a picture, it's slightly grainy, but hopefully you can still make it out. In an area in Belfast where there is gates which exist essentially between different communities. And the young person in front of this gate has thrown a petrol bomb into across this barricade over into the other community. This took place a couple of years ago at what would be known as an interface area. And a lot of what we're going to talk about today is looking at how we make sure that young people, like the young person in front of this photograph, find ways out of this activity. And crucially, we try and find ways to make sure that they are not involved in it in the first place. And it's very difficult and complicated work. We're going to talk a little bit about the context within which we operate. But before I do that, it's probably worth saying that Terry mentioned in her introductory comments about how people and communities have adapted since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And that's certainly been the case, and an incredible work has been done. It's also worth saying that before 2015, there was no dedicated focus on tackling or addressing paramilitary activity. So we were well into the peace process by that point. Groups had moved away in many cases from violent acts, but there was still violence taking place within communities. And although there were pockets of very good work taking place in various different areas across the country, there was no dedicated governmental focus on addressing paramilitarism. So it took until 2015 and an intergovernmental agreement called the Fresh Start Agreement to that actually started to happen. And that was the genesis for the programme that we are working on now. Originally, at that point, there were 43 individual recommendations which were collated on how to address what was the legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland after the peace agreements. And those 43 recommendations ranged from very small, discrete issues to very big issues around about attitudinal and societal change and reconciliation more generally. And a programme was constructed around about those recommendations to try and implement them. And in 2020, after a number of years of working through these recommendations, there was a review of what had been done. And we could say, looking down all those recommendations from a programme perspective, that much had been achieved and much had been delivered. But if we walked from our offices where we currently are, next to the Stormont buildings where the Assembly should sit when it's sitting, a mile down the road to an area where there's paramilitary control, we had to seriously question whether, despite having made lots of progress, it felt any different for people in communities who were still affected by paramilitarism. And I think the hard answer was, in some cases, it didn't feel very different at all. So there was a process of redesign of trying to think what we had learned from phase one of this programme about how to address paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, and how to turn that into something that was focused on outcomes and building peace more generally and addressing violence. Um, I'm really pleased that Claire Hazelden worked on that really important piece of work, and she'll tell you a little bit more later on about what that means in terms of how we have focused our activity and our efforts there. But what we have now is an opportunity. The programme is funded out to 2025. And we are trying to test and learn what works in terms of addressing this really complex, deeply embedded issue in Northern Ireland. So Claire, maybe we'll start just working through the slides to help describe some of that. So what you have in front of you, and I hope it's clear on screen, is what we describe as our triangle of harm, our triangle of paramilitary harm in Northern Ireland. At the very top, we have violence against the state. And traditionally, this has been the focus of activity. It's been the focus of resource allocation. It's been the focus of data and statistics and how that has been gathered. And that's entirely understandable given the situation that existed in Northern Ireland for decades. people, organisations, structures and systems tend to look at what is most acute and most serious. And in that case, there was a real legacy of bombings and shootings and violence against the state. So that very top part of the triangle. There was some focus, but far less, on serious personal and interpersonal violence, which was below that. At one point, these were called punishment shootings or punishment beatings. We have thankfully moved away from that victim blaming language into something that talks about paramilitary style assaults or attacks. But fundamentally, these are horrific, grievous injuries against persons, which are carried out still to this day by groups which have their roots in the conflict of the past. Some of these groups have fully transitioned to becoming organised crime groups. Others still use the cloak of ideology from the past as a way to tap into support tacitly, normally within communities. But the fact is that they are still carrying out horrific acts of harm within communities against their own communities. So they are the most overt and the most obvious types of violence which Northern Ireland has been wrestling with, which the programme has been wrestling with since its inception. But the reality is they don't appear out of nowhere. And serious though they are, in relative terms, they affect a relatively small amount of people. That's not to dismiss them or undermine them, it's just the reality. The reality is that there are a number of hidden harms which exist. All these hidden harms are the bottom part of the triangle. They are the things where less resource, less focus, less data, less understanding has traditionally been placed. And so what we find and what we have found over the number of years is that we have a situation where we have a skewed understanding of the problem. And that in itself is a problem. So the programme has been very consciously and very diligently trying to understand what is it that takes place in the bottom part of this triangle. What are the threats, the intimidation, the more hidden harms that exist within communities? How are young people exploited? How are they groomed into activity? We used to talk about recruitment into prescribed terrorist organisations. What we should really be describing that as is grooming, which requires a safeguarding response. These are the sorts of policy, structural, attitudinal changes that the programme is trying to drive and address. And research, as we'll come on to talk about, is a really big, important part of that. As we move down the triangle, more people are affected. There are lots of people who would experience gatekeeping, who would experience community control, money lending, the sorts of things which are really difficult to understand and get a handle on, but which are really, really important. So that's how we see paramilitary harm in the round in Northern Ireland. Claire, I think you're going to talk a little bit now about what that means in practical terms and the sort of prevalence that we see currently within Northern Ireland.
Yes, I think the first point to make really is that paramilitary harm is still highly localised in Northern Ireland. Some of you I know have been here, some of you are maybe from here. Northern Ireland's a lovely place. You'll maybe have heard about our thriving tourism industry, film and TV taking off here. There are huge parts of Northern Ireland that aren't impacted by these harms. But there are also pockets where these groups continue to exert control over entire communities. So the map on screen there just shows the areas, and the deeper the color, the more kind of exposure or control by paramilitary groups. And we measure this at population level. It's something that we will describe in a little bit more detail throughout the presentation, but you can see up there at population level, up to 40% of adults and 45% of young people experience paramilitary harm. In some areas, that's much higher. Where I'm from, up in the northwest in Derry, Londonderry, the percentage figure there was 60%. So it does vary from area to area, and like we say, it is particularly localized. There's also an intergenerational element of this. The diagram on screen is from one of the action research reports funded by the programme and developed by Dr. Colm Walsh at Queen's University. This report focused on child criminal exploitation in Northern Ireland, and you can see another triangle really just setting out how at the bottom there might be some engagement in things like public disorder with a lot of participants. Moving up the triangle, fewer people becoming actively involved in harms, and at the very top, the most vulnerable, but the fewest number involved in things like intimidations and supply with paramilitary groups. The underlying vulnerabilities there, as you can see, are very common risk factors across all types of harms. They should be, sadly, maybe familiar to many of you. And it's also complex. What we see across the programme is really a skewed sense of safety, not just with young people, but also among older people who, on the one hand, might feel particularly safe in their hyper-local area, as Terry described earlier, the place that they know, the place they're from, the place that they grew up in. But on the other hand, recognise that in some of these areas, paramilitary groups are active. Paramilitaries are controlling individuals, are carrying out acts of violence on a day-to-day basis. So as you can see there are also generational differences. At population level, 12% of adults believe paramilitaries are active in their area. In another of our research reports carried out by Colm McQueen's, 70% of the young people living in an area of elevated violence believe paramilitaries were active. So there's also differences across ages as well as locations.
Thanks, Claire. And really important to say that these statistics never existed 5-6 years ago. And that really speaks to the importance of our collaboration, not just with Dr. Colin Walsh, but more generally with academics and experts outside the policy fields, but in academia and in other professions. So understanding this problem, understanding the totality of this problem and how it manifests itself is really critical and a huge step forward for us. Wanted to talk a little bit about consequences. I think they will be fairly obvious to everyone on the call, but worth just flagging them. This is essentially what we're dealing with is the unfinished business of reconciliation. And it has to be seen as part of that. We are, unless we're addressing paramilitarism in the round and not just the top parts of that harm triangle, allowing trauma to persist within our society, creating that and deepening that. Paramilitarism is also driving considerable demand for services, understandably, within the public sector. And it means that we are incurring quite significant opportunity costs. The human and ethical reasons for intervening and addressing this are clear. But there's also a system-wide issue here. We have huge sectors of society where that prevalence is really high, that they're just not getting access to opportunities, and likewise we're not able to tap into that potential, and that's a significant problem. As long as this continues, we may not have inter-ethnic violence, but we certainly have the conditions where it is difficult to address division more generally, because we have communities which are themselves traumatized, and all of this really inhibits wider delivery. If you start to look at the extent of prevalence of this sort of harm in Northern Ireland, it's inconceivable that this will not have an impact on all sorts of policies and strategies which the executive and others are trying to implement, particularly in communities where this prevalence is particularly high. We're looking at some estimated costs at the moment. We think, again, these are estimates, somewhere in the region of £500 million per annum in terms of the cost of paramilitarism. I think that probably could be more. And trauma itself, not just connected to paramilitarism, but more generally, £1.3 billion a year. So there's a not insignificant financial cost alongside the human cost that this really gives us an imperative to make progress on. Thanks, Claire. So, big problem, what do we do about it? Well, we've tried lots of different things, as we said in phase 1 of the programme, and we have settled on a particular approach in phase 2, our public health approach, which is essentially not just about public health, for those of you that are not familiar with it, but it's about a relay team effort across sectors and professions to deal with this problem, because there is no project, however good it is, can solve this issue. This is very much about taking a problem in the rounds and applying all the different resources that we need to be able to address it. And the public health approach essentially treats violence like a virus. And we are there as a programme through our interventions and investment to try and interrupt the spread of that violence, and also to encourage other people to do this. Because again, this can't be a job only for our programme. This has to be a whole of government, whole of society approach. There are 4 clear steps in the public health approach, which are set out in front of you: defining, monitoring the problem, identifying risk and protective factors, developing and testing prevention strategies, and ensuring widespread adoption. We now have a much better understanding, particularly with the benefit of some of the academic research that we have invested in, understanding what that problem is. We have a good sense locally, nationally, and internationally what those risk and protective factors are. Many of them are common to different jurisdictions, but there are some ones here which are more prevalent in Northern Ireland because of the circumstances which have prevailed. And part of the job of the programme is to then develop and test different interventions. We have currently over 100 interventions operating across Northern Ireland, and if we stack them up end to end, we really should be able to see what a system response to this issue looks like, and what that looks like in terms of tackling violence and harm more generally. One of the big challenges is, how do we move that into widespread adoption? We should really be talking ourselves out of a job in this programme. We shouldn't exist. We should make sure that all the interventions that we have in good practice are essentially mainstreamed and become business as usual. I think we're a little bit off that at the moment, which we can perhaps talk about later. So what does that mean in practical terms? What does the programme look? How does it operate? How does it actually make an impact? Well, that model, as I said a minute ago, is focused on a whole of government approach, and it's also about focusing on outcomes and not outputs. Very easy to focus on outputs and talk about quantitative success. Much more difficult to actually get under the skin of this and think about whether we are making a difference. Claire, would you like to talk a little bit more about the detail behind this?
Sure. So Adele talked a little bit at the beginning about how the program came to exist and the recommendations that were put forward for tackling the problem back in kind of 2015, 2016. That part of the program ran until 2021. So from kind of 2020, when I started in the program, my role was really to evaluate progress against those measures and to see how the program could be tailored in phase 2 uh, to basically look at all of the great work and all of the interventions and how they collectively were making an impact. And I think that's one of the key points really, is that we were and are confident in the interventions that we're funding, that the work that's happening on the ground is good and is contributing towards everything that we want to achieve. But telling that story at a higher level and the cumulative impact of all of those interventions was proven to be challenging. Whenever I looked more widely, myself and my colleague as well, Dr. Christopher Farrington, at different interventions and different structures across, but locally, nationally, and internationally, there are lots of different ways of doing this, as I'm sure you all know. I think it's fair to say that no one's cracked it, and we certainly aren't claiming to have cracked it either. But I think it's a way that helps make some sense of the complexity that we're dealing with. And just to give you a little bit of background on how we came up with all of these things on the screen here. Towards the end of phase 1, we had an extensive engagement plan with all of our stakeholders, all of our many interested parties, all of our delivery bodies, to try to see what would be an ambitious but realistic outcome for the program for the next stage, the stage that we're currently in. And unfortunately, COVID happened, and all of our face-to-face engagements could not go ahead as we had planned. So instead, as sort of Zoom newbies, as I think we all were then, we rather clumsily tried to do it all online. And there were some that were more successful than others, but we did manage to speak to an awful lot of people during a very short period of time to come up with and then subsequently test this model. So first of all, it was about really agreeing that strategic objective. And that was harder than you might think, but we came up with something that everyone agreed with. And then working backwards from that. So trying to put ourselves in the shoes that we're almost in now in kind of 2024, 2025, and thinking, what are the big things that would need to change for us to be confident that we are on our way to achieving that overall objective of safer communities, resilient to paramilitarism, criminality, and coercive control? And the end benefits there in orange on the screen were the sort of big things that we thought, if we saw movement on these, if we saw positive change on these, we would collectively, we'd have a sense that we're heading in the right direction. So that's things like reduced paramilitary activity, people generally feeling more safe, more protected by the law and criminal justice system. As Terry mentioned, in a lot of these post-conflict societies, confidence in statutory services can be really low. So we wanted to reflect that here as well. Community resilience and individual resilience kind of represented in that reduction in membership of paramilitary groups and paramilitary organizations were the big kind of things that we knew, that we know will take a very long time to shift. So the next stage in our thinking was how we break those big kind of almost hard to imagine any success on things into smaller, more achievable steps. And these are all the intermediary benefits in green. And you'll see they're grouped together there. The first group is all about keeping people safe. The second is that community resilience framework, which was developed again in partnership with Cooperation Ireland, who went out and did a whole literature review for us on community resilience frameworks around the world. And we were able to tailor one for Northern Ireland. And then one on protective factors for individuals as well. So how we build individual resilience. This did not look like this in our first iteration or our second, or possibly even the 50th. It took an awfully long time to refine, to develop, to agree. We had brilliant challenge and conversations with all of our partners on this, and really that process was absolutely part of the whole thing. We wanted everybody working on this program to have a sense of ownership over these outcomes. They should be shared, they should be collective. They are things that all of our projects have to deliver against, at least one, if not most are delivering against more than one. And they all sit in these particular groups as well, sharing their learning, sharing their frustrations, sharing how they are measuring and evaluating. Because the other important thing about this is that each of these should be measurable. Each of these is measurable. We've checked quite a few times. So that's a little bit of background to the approach that we're using and the measures that we have. You'll see just along the side there too, the measures at the bottom, the intermediary benefits, are where we have the highest control and the highest confidence. And up towards the end benefits, those are the things we are mostly measuring at population level, or much greater numbers anyway, where we know the program has least control and where we know there are much bigger, more strategic factors at play. Very happy to take more questions on that if you have them.
Thanks, Claire. I don't know if there'll be any questions at the moment, but I wonder if we might just go into the whole of government approach, because I think what Claire has described there is a really complex process. And I think it's worth saying and just observing that we've all had to get a bit more comfortable being uncomfortable. Part of our role, by that I mean part of our role is to try and make sense of this. And I think we would be lying if we said that we have got our heads completely around this and that this is all easy and fits into nice, neat boxes. It generally doesn't. But this is a process that was really helping us to focus on the right outcomes. Having said we don't like nice, neat boxes, I'm going to try, well, they're not boxes, they're circles, but I'm going to try and boil this down. What does that mean in practical terms? We have some projects and investment which are focused on addressing harm in the here and now. So back to that public health approach, how do we stop that harm actually getting worse? How do we make sure that we're not always engaging in crisis intervention? Crisis intervention is important, but we need to get upstream of that. So we have projects which are also focused on breaking that cycle of harm. What are the early interventions? How do we get to the bottom part of that triangle? What is the right combination of interventions to be able to address that? And crucially, as Claire said, and it's back to that point, there are lots of things which are beyond the programme's control. We have investment, but that comes to a point where it ends. And actually what we need is other people to pick up this work. We need everybody to see addressing paramilitarism and paramilitary harm as part of their business as usual. So we're very much about looking at what are the enablers and dependencies outside the programme that need to shift to get us to the right place. That involves working with a broad range of people. And when the programme started, it was a tiny group of people that were working on this issue. It has gradually blossomed and grown, and people are increasingly more eager to work with us and to understand and play their part in contributing to it, which is absolutely fantastic and really crucial to the long-term longevity and impact of the programme itself. So we've talked a little bit about the structure of the programme. We're going to talk to you a little bit now about the progress that we think has been made, and we're defining that in lots of different ways at project and programme level in terms of some of the system change that we've managed to facilitate or are driving forward with, and some of the measurable outcomes that we're starting to see in projects. I think perhaps we can talk about statistics and qualitative and quantitative data, but we're going to try, if technology permits, to play a video, because there is a project that we are sponsoring and it's just one of many, but it really gets to the heart of what we're trying to address and also how successful it can be with relatively small amounts of investment. So Claire is going to see if she can get that working now. Bear with us.
I grew up in Monkstown. Well, it is kind of a hard place to grow up in because, like, the paramilitary activity, but it's close-knit and people overcome all of that, and it's a small, kind of cozy estate, so obviously everyone knows each other. You walk up the street and almost everyone that you pass, you know, you say hi, you smile to them. When I was about 10, my brother started to get in with the wrong crowds in school, and he wasn't always like that. He was actually quite smart. In the top class, he done well for himself, and then it started off with small things like smoking cigarettes, and then it would go into getting with the wrong crowds, and then doing drugs, and then getting into debt, and then stealing stuff from the house and having to repay his debts with that. Well, for a 10-year-old, it's quite a scary thing to have to watch. My mum and dad, they tried to shelter me as best as they could, but as my brother started to act out and become more aggressive, they couldn't shelter me from it as much. So I started to see him act out more, which thought I can act out more, but I didn't want to do it in the house. I wouldn't try to do it in the house. I was actually quite shy in the house, and then when I went outside, like, the smallest thing could tip me over the edge, and that would be me acting out and me being aggressive. But even though on the outside people saw like a tough girl, I was actually quite anxious and feeling quite alone. In first year, I heard people talking about the Monkstown Boxing Club, and I thought, I'll go have a look and see what it's all about. So I came in, and they didn't have all the stuff that they have today, but it was still amazing. So we came in and we'd done our homeworks, done a bit of boxing, went to the gym, ate some fruit, talked to people, socialised. About 3 years into my journey at the Monkstown Boxing Club, Abby came in, and it was different to have a girl in, but I was one of the first kids to work with Amy, and then she became my mentor, and it was easy to talk to her because she felt like the older sister that I never had, and it was easy to talk to her and relate to her because she was also from Monkstown. By the way the door opened, when she seen me coming in, that she knew what mood I was in. If I was in a bad mood, I could go and speak to Amy and I would be in much better mood. I would be happy. I wasn't that tough, anxious wee girl anymore. She made me feel like a young woman. She was one of the ones that introduced me to volunteering, and then I actually became a young leader in the boxing club. I actually got the chance to travel to America through the boxing club and look at how to work well in the community and how to work better together. Currently, I'm actually doing my A-levels and I'm deputy head girl, and I'm actually looking at going to university to study criminology. The thing that I've learned on my journey so far is that we can do better together.
So a bit of an insight into what's been done within the programme. I mean, it's probably important to say sports interventions, diversionary work, none of that is unique or new. It's been used in many different jurisdictions and situations. What's really important here is thinking back to that triangle. Amy and Courtney are the sort of people who would have been forgotten about before. The focus would have been traditionally on young men, on her brother, not necessarily on her. So the programme is trying to work through not just the individuals who are at risk, but their peers, their family, looking at the community around about them and looking at the societal attitudes too. So it's trying to link all of that up to make sure that support is there and across the board. And particularly in the case of young women, that their experiences of paramilitarism are not excluded as they have been in the past. Young men, that sort of stereotype of young men getting involved in violence and harm is absolutely something that we need to continue to address and support young men, but we need to make sure that we're also doing that for young women as well, who are increasingly relaying concerns about the extent of paramilitary harm. Claire, I'm not sure, do you want to go into some of these boxes here and tell a little bit more about the story of where we are?
I think we have time to do a little bit of that, yeah. So some of the highlights are up there on the screen, and I won't just read all of them out for you, but at project level, these are some of the things that we're seeing. And this is again where investing in action research has been invaluable. I think we find that the people delivering our projects are experts in what they do, and they do it really well. And obviously, we are funding them to do what they do really, really well. I think it's fair to say that many of them find the evaluation part of the process challenging. Sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's all of those things all at once. And so one of the benefits of the action research has been that we have a small team led by one academic who is working across most of the projects that we fund now, and particularly those that work with young people and with women. And we're having consistency then, both consistency and kind of excellence in the evaluation. The practitioners are familiar with the team, they understand the process, and they're engaging really, really well so that we're able to compare and look across projects. So some of the kind of project level results are up there. They're well, I think we're up to about 110 pages of information from our projects. All of it really, really valuable whenever we're making investment decisions around projects for the future. And we also have, beyond the project, the system level change, which I think I'll let Adele talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so I mentioned we've got some great interventions, and it's really important that we have some sort of legacy and that they have some sort of longevity. So partly that is about making sure that the learning that we have from the programme is taken on board, and that we drive systems change and we get people talking about this issue, so that again it's not just the programme focused on this sort of change. We are starting to get this rapidly emerging, rapidly improving evidence base, which is fantastic because it really helps us to refine our interventions, and that's the sort of thing that will give us long-term impact. We're also, because of the really hard work that Claire and Christopher and others have done to develop an outcomes-based framework, really able to say what outcomes are coming from the programme and whether investment is really delivering what it needs to. There are many cases where people are doing fantastic work and require investment, but not necessarily from this programme. So we have to be really clear-headed about what it is that we're focused on and where that limited investment can go. We are starting to get a lot of interest about the programme and how it works from other jurisdictions. And again, we'd be really happy to share that learning in more detail. One of the things that we are most proud of is being able to get the issue of child criminal exploitation onto the agenda. As I mentioned earlier on, for many years we have noted in passing that young people are being recruited into paramilitary prescribed terrorist organisations. We shouldn't be saying they're being recruited, we should be saying they're being groomed. And the research that we've been able to glean from both the projects and our academic colleagues means that we are now able to address that on a system-wide basis beyond the programme. That's a game changer in terms of being able to start to break this cycle. That won't be easy, but it means that it's not just relying on the programme to deliver change. And we think from an executive perspective, a Northern Ireland government perspective, that we have an outcomes-based programme here working across sectors, dealing with complex violence and trying to make sense of all this, which could be a pathfinder for looking and addressing other types of social issues. So we think there's lots here that we can capitalise upon, and which is starting to drive that sort of wider system change and collaborative working, which is easy to say and quite difficult to do.
So I talked you through some of the measurable outcomes and the framework that we have across the programme. And this is really just another way of visualising it. So as part of our governance arrangements with the programme, we RAG rate all of our measures, and we look at a matrix across a whole load of different measures really to score them on that and determine whether they're red, amber, or green very, very originally. So this is really just a snapshot of doing this. And I think it's really important to see how on track we are across the entire programme and where we have areas that we need to focus on. So you'll see, for example, in protective factors, we have struggled with this one around exit routes, which is really about providing a way out for individuals, particularly young people who find themselves groomed, recruited, exploited into these gangs. That's a really difficult, challenging piece of work that we absolutely want to do, and we know that it's going to take longer than some of these other things. So yeah, it's just really another way of visualizing our outcomes.
So we've hopefully started to give you a bit of a sense of momentum here. There's obviously a lot of data and research that we can't convey to you just through this medium, but we'd be very happy to delve into more detail at another time if you thought that would be helpful. Engage with you directly. But we wanted to point out some of the challenges. This is not easy work to do. It's not easy work on a strategic and policy level. It's incredibly difficult for frontline practitioners who in many cases are having to deal with really a level of complexity that kind of is difficult to comprehend, and in some cases at some personal cost to them and some risk in some cases to their own personal safety, and we're always very mindful of that. So they're the very they're the challenges which exist from the frontline delivery right the way through to strategic. I'm going to focus on a couple of strategic issues here. One is that as a system, we have become experts in crisis intervention, and that's not unfamiliar in many sort of post-conflict societies where people have had to deal with very complex situations in very difficult environments. It tends to push us towards complex late-stage interventions. In Northern Ireland, there are some excellent examples of that. And while we don't want to lose that expertise, we need as a system and structurally to think about how we apply resource to the bottom part of the triangle, and back to thinking about how we can do earlier intervention more effectively and apply resource there. So that's a real challenge for us. How do we start to shift that without losing the much needed effort that we have and the expertise in crisis intervention? I've mentioned repeatedly the need for us not just to focus on what the programme can deliver, but what society as a whole can address in terms of this issue. It's shorthand here is the 13 billion, not the 16 million. 16 million per annum is what the programme receives in terms of funding, and we can invest. The 13 billion, probably a little bit out of date, is what the Northern Ireland Executive Government have in their budget. So how can we make that whole budget work to address this problem? Because it is affecting It's affecting every aspect of life within Northern Ireland, and particularly in some communities. Trauma is the other issue that we see constantly. If we can click in there, Claire, we can just give an indication of some of the findings that we've had. Again, this is really helping us understand what to do in terms of intervention. But the scary figure is that 25 years after the peace agreements, almost all of our young people presenting in this programme are experiencing trauma, some of it very complex. Many of them are experiencing and witnessing paramilitary violence at a very young age. And indeed, 13, 14 is the average age to be threatened or attacked by a paramilitary group. So we have an intergenerational problem here, which has not ended with the peace agreements. And we really need to think very carefully about how we can use research and evidence and policy and our policy understanding to support these young people. Some of the fairly horrific pictures that are around about this screen are from public awareness campaigns that we have run. This speaks to a number of things. One, the need to challenge what is normal and what is considered to be normal and a normal level of violence within society, in a post-conflict society. The other is how much we actually need to show and how graphic we need to be in terms of actually getting people to take notice of this, and that's a very difficult thing to do. We are currently running a number of public awareness campaigns, and this is about changing attitude. It's about changing what is considered to be normal and tolerable within communities, and about helping people to think differently about this. And it's a very difficult thing to get right. Our latest campaign focuses on illegal money lending, which again is the bottom part of that triangle. It's a hidden harm, but it's something that we know can lead to people being involved in, and being exploited by paramilitary groups of various different kinds. We have a very short video. It is about 40 seconds and it's fairly powerful. So this will give you a sense of what is currently being screened in Northern Ireland in terms of what we think needs to happen to try and start to break some of these attitudes that contribute towards the persistence of this problem.
If you'd paired up, none of this would be happening. And if you touch that,
So a bit of buffering there, but hopefully you'll get the idea. I think what this shows as well is that in many cases, I noticed in one of the Q&A that's been submitted, there was a question about whether this is ideologically driven. Many of the groups that we're dealing with, this is not about ideological issues, this is about organised crime and criminality. And you can see the connection very clear here. Again, very consciously trying to say this is what's happening in many cases in a hidden way within communities. And it's affecting, again, not just young men, but women as well, and really difficult to try and address this, but in many cases a lot of this is relating to wider criminality. Claire, I think we've got, you're probably trying to share again. We've ended on, I guess, somewhat of a serious note. I would say important for you to see that, but also important to recognise that there's huge progress being made here. We need leadership. We need political leadership and local leadership. And in many cases, we have local leadership in spades. We also need political leadership, which we continue to work on, even though we don't currently have a government in Northern Ireland. And we have support across all the different political parties for the work that we're doing within the programme. There is an awful lot of good that's going on here. This is long, slow, sense-making work. We would love to be able to point to nice, neat solutions. We can't. We have a much better idea of what is working, but we still have a long way to go in terms of trying to change those sort of population level measures that are about that will show us that actually the programme and the wider systems are moving in the right direction. So we'll perhaps stop there, and we'll leave some time for questions. Just final comment on that final slide, which I think probably sums up a lot of what we're trying to do. The original graffiti was in Strabane, and the call was to join the IRA. Some clever person managed to insert some other letters and highlight the protective factor that education is. Join the library. A nice simplistic way to say there is ways to reduce risk and wrap protection around about people and communities, and that's very much what we're trying to do. So hopefully a more hopeful note to end on. Terry, thank you very much.
Thank you to the two of you. To the audience, why don't you, if you have some questions, take some time to formulate them and pop them into the Q&A box. And in the meantime, I'll just ask a couple questions, and they're touching on some questions that are already raised by some people. So one will be about paramilitarism more generally, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about research and evidence. So a curiosity I think we have here is that the Troubles were a long time ago, and the civil rights and into the 70s, and then this very difficult period of time that you all went through, and then this amazing accord happened, and it was celebrated, and it is celebrated around the world. It really stopped some things, and it was hard earned and on many levels very, very effective. And yet there's the ... And what's confusing for us is why paramilitarism continues. The kids that we see throwing things at PSNI vehicles, they look like they're 13 or 14 or 15. And so they weren't even born. They've been born since the agreement was signed. So wondering if you can just tell us why is this persisting? I mean, you've alluded to it, but the actual paramilitary structures, why have they persisted? Curious if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure, we can both pick this up. So I think there's a number of different reasons. We could probably have a whole other session on this question alone. We tend to talk, and I'm using shorthand here, so forgive me, but for expediency, we talk in the programme about the 3 T's. So tradition, trust, and trauma. Now, they're not the only reasons why these groups persist, but they do tend. It's a kind of shorthand way of looking at this. I mentioned the traditional way of approaching this, and traditionally this has been to police out and use justice-related focuses, policy interventions to try and address this issue, and they have worked to a certain extent. If we looked at a graph in terms of violence and harm, we would see a downward trajectory since the peace agreements in terms of the enforcement activity which has been taken against paramilitary groups of different types. But the reality is there are still very complex relationships with paramilitary groups in communities. And as Claire mentioned, in many cases, some communities feel that they do provide a function. So it's not as simple as saying paramilitary is bad, hoof them out of communities. That there are very complex relationships there, and we're still dealing with people who have experienced that trauma and conflict, even if the young people haven't. Trust is another issue. We know that in many cases the state is still a contested concept within Northern Ireland for some communities. And that evolves over time. And the problem with the lack of trust is, as we know in terms of statutory provision and the provision that the state makes, is that if people can't access support and resources, that's another risk factor that groups will exploit. And groups will continue to try and control and coerce within communities, and they will continue to exploit any vulnerability. So where there is that lack of trust, that lack of connection, either to services or to community, that can present significant opportunities for groups to carry out control and coercion. In many cases, as I said, these groups are not ideologically driven. They are driven by crime and criminality, but they still use that sort of cloak of the past to allow them to create this sort of permissive environment. And then we talked about trauma. We should not underestimate the impact of trauma within individuals and communities and the system as a whole. in terms of thinking how we respond to this. So if we continue to, again, focus on crisis intervention instead of early intervention, we will continue to have young people who are throwing petrol bombs at police cars. I would say the indicators are all moving in the right directions. We have still got some significant challenges to face, but we have seen some incredible movement in the right direction, which is starting to help us understand how we will make sure that this young generation in particular, and some of the interventions that we've got in place, really make sure that we shouldn't be continuing this cycle and that they have the support that they need to not get pulled into this further. Claire, I don't know if you want to pick up on any of that or add other things.
I think the only other thing that came to mind really was that sometimes we're asked, how is this different from gang culture in other cities in the UK or in the US? What's different about it? And actually, on the face of it, there's nothing different about it. The risk factors are the same, the protective factors are the same, the underlying reasons why young people get caught up in this sort of activity, they're the same. It's the contextual factor that's different, and it's the fact that these groups remain and they remain active in certain areas of Northern Ireland. If they weren't there, if they never existed, then maybe Northern Ireland would have something that looks much more like a gang problem. I don't know. It's obviously impossible to say, but I think there is that that extra element of it that just makes this place and this issue slightly more complex.
Okay, and just to clarify, and I know I don't think you use the term DDR. You use the term DDR during your peace agreement process, but were these paramilitary organizations dismantled? Was it an expectation that they dismantled and the structures were to come apart? Was that part of the deal, or was that just that was left out of the deal?
Do you want to go, Claire, or do you want me to go? I'll go.
Go for it.
Yeah. So there continues to be an expectation that any groups which have their roots in the conflict are still prescribed or still in existence would disband. And there has been significant progress in that respect. There is no doubt about that. But as I say, we're talking about groups which in many cases have morphed into something else. They have morphed into more of the organised crime groups that, as Claire mentioned, you would recognise from other jurisdictions. So it's a slightly different context, and we're having to evolve our response in response to their evolution as well.
Okay. All right. Then let me just ask one more question, and then we'll look to see what others have put into the box. So in terms of research, I'm curious, what's the difference? Because it seems like you're almost a donor and you're writing policy and you're conducting research. I don't know if you would call yourself a donor, but you have money that you give to people that are going to be doing these programs. So I'm guessing you know the language that sometimes donors will use, monitoring and evaluation, and that is the evidence that they're looking for, versus you also work with academics and their kind of evidence and what they're looking for is not the same. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about the difference between an M&E model and how you experience the academic research model. And then what has been effective and helpful for you in terms of working with academic researchers? And then what might be some of the challenges as you try to serve as both a donor and creating interventions with that quality of research? Just if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Claire, do you want to pick up on this? Because I think you've been closer to driving the action research. You're far more expert than I am in this.
I would love to talk about this. I could talk about this all day too. You're right, Terry. We are in a slightly funny place. When the program started, this action research project wasn't in place, and I think there had been some discrete research projects that had been commissioned by the program team on specific issues. So there's always been that kind of relationship, desire to learn. The original recommendations from the independent panel report were absolutely rooted in best practice. I think at least one of the panel members was an academic, so you know we have that's in the program's genesis. But I think it's fair to say Northern Ireland is a really small place. Lots of people know each other. We want to be the best that we can be. We want to deliver the best interventions that we can, and we really want to support the people delivering the interventions. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, we want them to be able to get on with doing the things that they're really good at doing, that we're funding them to do. But we also, as a program team, have a role in trying to understand this wider context, this phenomenon of paramilitarism that, as Adele said, there wasn't a government focus on up until 2015. So we have a bit of catching up to do in terms of our understanding there, and in terms of gathering data and evidence and all of the things that can inform our interventions. And we can only do so much of that as a program team, and that was a gap that we kind of noticed quite early on. So the idea of funding an action research project came from that. And initially, it was really just looking at young people and the vulnerabilities around young people. It came from a recommendation in the original report that was specifically about young people. Um, and that first stage of the project was really successful in forming those relationships with the youth workers, with the teams delivering the interventions, and it was really built into the contract that the practice would inform policy and would be reflected in the research, you know, and vice versa, that where we could see best practice from elsewhere, it could inform the practice in real time, essentially. And that, you know, the value of that is it's really hard to overstate, actually. It's been so great. So I think I've spoken a lot to the effectiveness of it all. In terms of challenges, I mean, a lot of them are good challenges to have. We now have so much information, and you know, not lots of time or people with which to analyze it and effectively translate it. So there's a lot of prioritization, I think, that we do, and our framework, the measures that we use inform that. So where do we need to get a little bit more movement on, you know, which are close to being realized, which are we making really good progress on, that maybe we don't need loads more information on. So following that public health approach for each of those measures is really effective. We can see where some are ready to be scaled up and where some actually need much more data and information behind them. So I suppose that they're good challenges to have, in a sense. Was there anything you wanted to add there, Adele?
No, that's entirely comprehensive as usual.
Why don't we combine? There's a question from Kevin who's wanting to know about whether or not some of your interventions are arts-based, and if you use those, if so, if they're beneficial. And then Jeffrey's wondering about the role of church leaders, and are they part of some of your work, part of the solution, and also are they part of the problem?
Right, okay. Do you want me to focus on them, or do you want to go through all the questions? What's your preference?
Well, why don't you do those two, and then we can, I'm just trying to kind of couple some of them together that
Okay.
seem like they belong.
So arts-based interventions, yes, we do, and we would be happy to pass on some separate information on what specifically we're doing. It's a fantastic way of engaging people in a non-confrontational way. One of the big problems that we face, when I say non-confrontational, I still mean in a challenging way, but not necessarily adversarial. One of the problems that we face is that even talking about paramilitarism, using what back in 2016 people used to refer to the P word because they didn't want to say paramilitarism. So that's how, you know, how far we've moved. You know, that we now can talk about things in different ways, and we talk about safety, we talk about vulnerability, we talk about exploitation. We talk about this problem in different ways, and because it's easier to do that and engages a much wider group of people, and the arts and arts interventions are a really useful way to do that, and it's also about people figuring this out for themselves. The last thing that we should be doing as a government programme is telling people what to do. This is about communities empowering themselves to become more resilient. So if we can facilitate those conversations, if people can have those conversations and come to their own conclusions, that's a far more effective solution. The other one I think was about faith leaders. Is that right? So absolutely critical, as are many other credible voices within communities and society as a whole, to be able to challenge some of this activity. Again, it doesn't need to be about standing up and saying, I'm tackling paramilitarism. It's about talking about those risk factors that happen within communities, about the wider adverse experiences that people might be facing, whether that ranges from individual things that are going on in people's lives to community experiences. And faith leaders have got a really important role to play in that. We have some fantastic contacts who are really vocal about what is happening within communities and able to address some of these issues and speak to people in a way that perhaps the programme can't. We've not had any particular problems. I think there are some who are more engaged than others, but we'll take the wins where we can and take those who are engaged. I don't know, Claire, if there's anything you want to add on that.
No, again, very comprehensive. Thank you.
Pedro, our good friend from Colombia, posed a question where he says that one of the phrases in the presentation was, that's a police problem. Is that a common perception in the communities, and how, in terms of the police are the problem, and how do communities respond? I think this is the second one, to the program. Maybe, I'm not sure if it's the police programming or policing, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that dynamic relationship.
So again, back to that, so the point we're trying to make here was that structurally and systemically, many people see addressing paramilitarism as something that needs to be policed out, that law enforcement should take the lead. And there, from a policy and structural perspective, the organisations that should be focused on this are the justice sector, Department of Justice, the ones that are focused on sort of later stage interventions. Coupled with that, we do know that trust and confidence in policing is a significant issue, and again, that's one of the things that we're very keen to address, and we're addressing that through specific interventions within the programme. How different communities feel about that, I think there is significant concern within communities about policing. That's not reflected in one community or the other. You know, the traditional divide in Northern Ireland, that's reflected in both communities, and that's something that we're working very hard to address. It's back to that point. If the community don't have confidence in the police, but still need to engage in or need to have some sort of service provision, there is the opportunity for groups, paramilitary groups, organised crime groups, to step in and fulfil that function. So we need to address that issue, and that's a long, slow, complex issue, and it's also one that has to be tailored to specific communities. There's no one size fits all response here, but what we do know is we can't just rely on the police to address this problem. This is about addressing the underlying vulnerabilities and factors which drive people into this activity. Not many people voluntarily, willingly want to sign up to an organised crime group and everything that entails, but in many cases the risk factors that propel them towards that are things that can't be addressed by the police and need to be addressed by others.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but did, in some communities during COVID, paramilitary groups actually provide services to communities?
Yeah, they did, Terry, and it's again, it speaks to this really complex relationship that communities have with some of these groups. So in many cases, we saw cases where paramilitary organised crime groups would be delivering food parcels or medicine or prescription. In other cases, it could have been about sorting out perceived antisocial behaviour within communities. The trade-off, and I'm using that very carefully, is that in many cases, these groups will, at some stage, if they haven't already, call in those favours. You know, so that we've seen, and there's documented cases of groups standing outside food banks, for instance, now identifying people who are vulnerable and therefore who can be potentially approached to become involved in or be the subject of debt, illegal money lending. So there's all sorts of nefarious activity going on, and groups can look different ways, and they can do different things at different times. But fundamentally, there's rarely an altruistic reason. It's generally that there'll be some sort of favour to be called in at a later stage, ranging from relatively simple to incredibly serious.
Okay. All right, let's see what other questions have been posed here. You're getting some kudos on your brilliant work. Let me see. Do you see any that pop out that you don't feel like you've answered?
I'm noticing that the one on the subtitles, which I have to confess were making me slightly smile as we were going through. They weren't the most accurate.
Yeah, clearly, and you mentioned that even before we met on this, but yeah, kind of funny. Some of the translations were actually pretty funny. So let me see. I think Caleb has asked a question about how entwined these groups are within communities, and do they draw popular support? And I think you've alluded to that, and whether or not they're filling gaps left by the government. Do you want to speak any more about that? I think you've covered it, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's worth saying that it's very Claire spoke about the highly localized nature of this. That this is not something, although we have high levels of prevalence, it tends to be in relatively localized areas. So I wouldn't want to convey the impression that in communities across the board, we have a situation where the government is not able to provide services. I think just in some communities, there are really very complex relationships, and a lot of that stems to what has gone before, but a lot of it is also the product of um, continuing much wider issues, around about poverty and adversity and opportunity and hope and aspiration. And I think there are many communities that, and this is way beyond the immediate gift of the programme, there are many communities which feel that perhaps the peace process, and we hear this often, hasn't necessarily delivered for them in a way that they had expected. And I think trying to understand those concerns and bridge the expectations is really, really important if we're going to address this problem in the longer term. Claire, I don't know if you want to come in on that in terms of research or evidence that we might point to.
I think it's as you said, it's complex and it's something that I think we need to collectively just work to understand better to be able to tailor our interventions appropriately. And the small nature of Northern Ireland sometimes doesn't help that either. It's difficult to convey, but sometimes it is street to street differences here. That hyper local point, Roddy and Roger spoke so well about last week, how different things can be from one street to another. It's really, really stark, and something that's, it's challenging when we're funding all sorts of different things with all sorts of different populations.
yeah, I think when you were, I think it was last year, right, where you did your 25th anniversary. Was it last year? Yes, it feels like it's been a bit, but I think it was last year. I know that there were, given what has happened with Brexit and some of the other governmental challenges, there was discussion that peace was more fragile than would have been expected. And also this question around reconciliation. I've heard some of my friends and colleagues there say that you don't like that word reconciliation. So curious if you can talk a little bit more just about the concept of peace and the substance of it. And has peace been realized in Northern Ireland? Yes and no, but could you talk a little bit about this concept of peace and what it means? And then also, what about reconciliation and social reconciliation? And why have I experienced and heard pushback against that word, that terminology, and whether or not you think social reconciliation has been taking place and is effective?
So I think Claire has quite a lot to say in this, but I'll offer a few observations maybe just to start off with. I think peace is always fragile, and I think, you know, it's very easy to talk about 25 years having passed, and people talking about new generations, and in some ways it feels like a long time, and in other ways it's a blink of an eye. And I think, you know, if we think that 25 years will consolidate peace, then I think that's the first problem. That this is going to be generations in the making, um and active peace building. And I think one of the challenges is that peace has been politicized to a certain extent, I think, in Northern Ireland. And so therefore talking about peace, we need to find more creative ways around about doing that. So we talked previously about how we don't always talk about paramilitarism. We might talk about safety or vulnerability, and I think, or exploitation, whatever that might be. I think we need to get more creative ways around about talking about peace building and reconciliation in a way that doesn't draw us into the political. Those political debates are really important and they need to happen, but there is a broader body of work and effort that needs to continue and needs to be away from that frame and needs to be focused again on outcomes. There's huge amounts of fantastic work that has been done and really, really effective. And the country is incomparable to where it was 25 years ago. But I do think there's still a fragility about this, and I think we shouldn't gloss over that. But we probably just need to be sensitive to it. And I think from our perspective, one of the best things that we can do is start to talk a little bit more about the trauma that exists and how that manifests itself and how that can influence how we perceive the piece as well. And I think once we know more about that and we start to apply a trauma lens to that, because we're dealing with a country that is fundamentally traumatized, and a system of policymaking as well that I think has experienced some trauma. So how do we start to address that? I think that's one of the game changers that we might want to point to. Claire?
Yeah, I think it's to, you know, what you asked, Terry, the quality. What is the quality of the peace that we experience here? And, you know, for, like I said right at the beginning, for lots of people in Northern Ireland, this thankfully isn't an issue that they ever encounter or probably even ever think about. But for many others, it's a daily reality. Paramilitary intimidations are a fact of life for some communities, for some individuals. And, you know, that distinction is another form of inequality in our society that is a result, or is part of the result of the conflict that we had here. So I'd say the quality of the piece is still unequal, and we see that time and time again. So that's why Adele talked about, you know, thinking of a mile down the road from where we are today. How are things for people there? You know, what are the issues they're experiencing? It's why we invest in area-based work as well that is targeted to those particular locations, and why we try to understand as best we can those hidden harms and the things at the bottom of the triangle. And they're not at the bottom of the triangle because they're less important. It's just because they're less visible and they affect more people. So I think understanding that is the start. Acknowledging it is part of it as well. Because even doing that can be difficult in a place where the peace we do have is hard won, and where we should rightly be celebrating the 25 years since, you know, a momentous peace agreement, but where things, you know, maybe don't feel like that for everyone here. Hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions. Matt Coleman, is just right down the hall from me. He's a geographer. He says it's impressive to tackle big geopolitical issues through the lens of kids and adolescents. These populations are generally disregarded. How has this lens shifted your understanding of the situation? Shifting to adolescents.
So Claire will definitely have a view on this. So my experience in the programme is that It's generally easier to get people to coalesce around about addressing a problem that is focused on helping young people. There's also something in terms of outcomes, in terms of surety of outcomes, that we tend to get better results the earlier we intervene. So I think there's something about looking through this lens in terms of being able to demonstrate success and demonstrate what works, which is really, really useful. With some of the older cohorts, we tend to see a lot more complexity, and the outcomes are less certain. So I think looking at young people gives us the opportunity to think at things differently. One of the really impressive things with some of our delivery partners is the extent to which they engage the young people themselves to come up with solutions in terms of what interventions work. So it's not a case again of the programme coming up with ideas and suggestions. It's about engaging them in terms of what works for them. So I think it does tend to give us a different perspective on things, and one that's quite challenging at points. And there is something about trying to think through outcomes and how effective they will be. I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully that's helpful.
I think the only other thing I wanted to add on to it was that it is a helpful lens, for sure, but it's also one that we need to bear in mind. Terry, at the start, and the picture we had up there at the beginning of that young person with a petrol bomb at an interface site, the reality is that young people are getting involved with criminality. They're being coerced into joining groups, and we need to understand why that is, and what is happening. What are the mechanisms there that are still allowing this to occur? So yeah, I think it's crucial that we bear that in mind.
We'll use this as our last question before we transition and I say what's happening in the future here. So how do you build hope for the future within affected communities as a counter message from paramilitary gains? And I know some people from Corrymeela community are on this listening in, and they have a whole initiative on hosting hope or hope as a critical part of their work. And so I'm wondering, how do you do that? And is there hope? Do you see that there's hope for the future for young people, for dismantling the hold that paramilitarism has on these communities, and whether or not your programs actually are offering that kind of hope?
So maybe come in from a strategic perspective, and then maybe Claire, you might want to talk about the sort of community resilience framework and how that contributes to that issue. So I noticed another question in the Q&A that said, are you hopeful for the end of paramilitarism? I'm hopeful in as much as I think we know, or we're beginning to know, and actually in a very short space of time, what works to address it. So that's at that strategic level, and that's really important, because if we can get the right approach in place, the right interventions in place, and the right sort of attitudes and behaviours at sort of societal level that start to challenge this, then I'm very hopeful. How you actually do that in a community sense, I think, is way beyond the gift of the programme itself. We can certainly do that and work in particular communities, and long-term investment is crucial here, and very difficult to do when you don't have a government to be able to do that. But actually giving people the space and the time to work through these issues themselves, and to do some of the positive reinforcement around about progress. It's very easy for us in our jobs, and we do this all the time. We kind of want to rush towards conclusions and say we have reached the point of success, and this just takes a long time. So what are the staging points and the markers that we can reaffirm with people in communities and say this is going in the right direction? Because I think if you're sitting in a community and you feel like you've been left behind, and either the government or others are not supporting you, that can feel like a pretty desolate, hopeless place. So there are things that we can do within the community, and we are seeing particular cohorts, young people, women, young men, starting to have hope on an individual level. How we build that sense of community from that and how we work on a community level is complex as well. But that's partly why we have very consciously included a community resilience framework within the programme to try and break that down. What does hope look like? How can we actually foster that? And some of the benefits that we're seeking to realise within the programme are very much focused on that. Claire, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more in that respect.
Yeah, just very, very briefly, because I am conscious of time, but one of the measures in our community resilience framework is increase hope and belief in capacity for change. And we wanted both of those things together because we know that hope on its own doesn't always translate into action or belief that things can change. So I think it was really important to have both of those. Measuring that across the projects is one thing, but as Adele said, how that translates from individuals or smaller groups, even larger groups within communities to whole scale change and real hope is again one of those things that is beyond our gift. But what we try to focus on are the parts that we can change, and where we can influence the wider things, then we're absolutely trying to do that as well. But yeah, it's so important. Without that, there's probably no point in doing the rest of it, really. So hope is absolutely important.
These young people need to see a way out. I mean, that's the hope. That's the glimmer of hope for them. So thank you, Adele and Claire. We've learned a lot today. And it's been helpful just to see how research integrates and interfaces with your policies and with your intervention strategies. So thank you for that. And thank you to the audience. We're glad you attended. For those of you that might have missed the first presentation, we've uploaded that recording on Mershon's YouTube channel, and we will also upload this one onto the YouTube channel. And then our next event, just so you're aware, is at the very end of January, on the 31st of January, and we're going to learn about Notre Dame's Accord Matrix database. So we're going to look at a database, and in particular, their Barometer initiative, which is tracking the implementation of Colombia's final accord and peace process with FARC. So different focus, different methodologies, and will, I'm sure, also be very, very special. So thanks for coming today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.